My name is David Beck. I'm a member of the Oregon Wine Growers Board of Trustees, Board of Directors, I guess. What are we called? Board of Trustees or Directors? Is Terry? I don't know. And I'm also a member of the committee that was partly involved, part of the committee that was involved in organizing the Oregon Wine Symposium Live. We're delighted to be here, and I'm especially happy to see the quality of the programming we've put together. The idea was for you to have something to take home that was actionable. That's our watchword, and that will be the case for this particular session as well. You all heard this morning, I hope, the talks by Kevin Pogue and Greg Jones about climate change and where one plants and how one plants and what one might be doing in the future. The point of the subtext in capital letters and bold capital letters for all of what they were talking about is, I think, likely to turn out to be water as a major determinant of how we deal with climate change. For those of us who must use water for irrigation, that's pretty straightforward. It's already on the books. For those of us, like many of us, perhaps three-quarters of us in the Willamette Valley who are dry farmed, increasingly the issue will become how do we get access to water to accommodate some aspects of climate change. The key thing, I'm going to try to scare you a little bit and then let these three gentlemen behind me straighten me out, is that all water belongs to the state. We may be privileged to use it, and perhaps under certain circumstances, under appropriate regulation, we can get access to it, but all water belongs to the state, and so that's a key thing to start out remembering. To tell us a little bit about how we get access, about some of the regulations and how we get access to water, I'm pleased to introduce three folks who know how to do this and are part of the regulatory and legislative process. Kevin Chambers, formerly of Coosa Farm Vineyards, Adam Sussman from a company called Water Resources, and Representative Kevin Helms, a member of the Oregon Legislature, will talk to you. And Kevin is going to be the moderator of the panel, and I'm happy to say that I think this will be something that you will all have take-home information that will be critical to how you farm and how you manage your vineyards as climate makes it necessary to talk more and more about water. Thank you.
Thanks, David. We all have the unique distinction of turning water into wine. That is our task as grape growers and winemakers. I'm going to start off by sharing a firsthand experience about trying to obtain water rights, and then I'm going to turn the stage over to people who can share with you how to do it right. But I thought it would be worthy to hear one man's story of how to do it wrong. We all, as David said, about three-quarters of the grape growers in the Willamette Valley are dry farming. And so I can see that we don't have quite as full an audience as we had for the first session, which, by the way, I thought was fantastic. And that's probably because those who aren't in the room don't think they have anything to worry about. But they do. and I think our speakers this morning helped you understand that. As we go forward, it isn't just about watering our grapes, but it takes a tremendous amount of water to make wine. In fact, I did some analysis several years ago that demonstrated that Oregon wineries were using 7 gallons of water to produce 1 gallon of wine. And that did not include any water applied in the vineyard. As things get restricted, we're going to have to adapt, okay? So anyway, what happened to me? I started the development of Coosaw Farm about 9 years ago, and I wanted to do a permaculture project, so I chose a second commercial crop, and that being cider apples. And I placed those cider apples on dwarfing rootstocks so I didn't have to climb a ladder to pick apples. Well, dwarfing rootstocks are a very delimited rooting system, and I knew I had to have water to get them established. I also happened to know that I was developing a vineyard in a groundwater limited area. So I had some vague notion that there's restrictions, but I thought I was actually outside of the Eola Hills groundwater limited area. I thought it literally ended at my southern property boundary. So I decided to go see the Water Resources Board, and the first lesson I got was, oh yes, your southern property line is the end of the Eola Hills groundwater limited area, but that's where the Walnut Hill, Amity Hills groundwater limited area begins. So guess what? I was in a groundwater limited area. And that basically means that the use of groundwater is very restricted. And I learned two other things right away. My domestic well is not a water right. I hope you heard me, because I know many, many people out of ignorance are using a domestic well to water a vineyard, and some of them in the groundwater limited areas. You can't do that, folks. The other thing I learned that was just because I might have surface water, that is a pond on my property, that didn't constitute a water right either. I had no right to use that water to water a vineyard or an orchard. So I applied for a temporary permit to use my domestic well to water my apples. And about 8 months later, I get a letter from the Oregon Water Resources Department saying, oh, Mr. Chambers, no, you can't use your domestic well to water your apples even temporarily. In fact, you can't use your well for any commercial purpose. And that might include, you can't use that water to spray your vineyard or your orchard. That, by the way, hasn't been tested in court, but it's possible. So I was in a real quandary now. I already had these apples in the ground. I had a problem. So I said, okay, well, what water don't you regulate? And they said, well, rainwater, if it's off of an impervious surface like a roof or a parking lot, you can collect that and use that. So I solved my problem by putting in a rather large rainwater collection system off my barn roofs, and I use that, well, as David said, I sold my property, but the system is in place to water the orchard using that system. So that's how you, well, and I should say there's one important piece of information in there, and that was that my well wasn't on the state well log. And that meant that the Water Resources Division didn't know how many perched aquifers I was penetrating with my well, so they just said, ixnay, can't do anything with it. Because if you're going to get a temporary permit, you have to do it from just one aquifer. Okay? Important caveat. So with that, that's how you not do it. That's how you don't get a water right. Adam Sussman is going to tell you how you do it right.
Good afternoon. I'm Adam Sussman, and I'm with a company called GSI Water Solutions, and I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. Our firm has offices in Portland and Corvallis and Bend, and we're made up of water resources specialists, hydrogeologists, and environmental scientists. And we do a lot of work with vineyards and wineries, and we love working with them. We often get calls from someone like Kevin and try to rescue them if we can. So we really appreciate the opportunity to talk about this. I want you to know that I got my training by working 14 years for the Oregon Water Resources Department. So that's where I cut my teeth on this water rights stuff, and I think it'll be helpful for me to just share what I learned over those years, and then since 2005 as a consultant. Let's see. So I was asked to start off with just a little bit of Water Rights 101, and I'll get back to that real quickly. And then I'll give you some general considerations about things to think about when you're seeking a water right. There's a lot we can talk about today, and I was asked to kind of focus on what does it look like to seek a new water right for irrigation. So I'll mostly focus on that. We'll get into some specifics about what does it look like to get a permit to use a well for irrigation. And then I'll give you some food for thought in terms of alternatives as well. So I like to start these presentations with my favorite character, Garfield. Just I think Kevin kind of nailed it. The world's changing. We all know that. It's not like the good old days where you can go throw a pump in a creek or just fire up your well and start irrigating. It's a lot more complicated. There's a lot more things to understand, a lot more rules to follow, and regulations to understand. So I just want to make sure we set the context here. In terms of Water Rights 101, I'm going to throw around some terms, so I thought we'd just stop and just build a quick foundation about water rights. And Kevin's already mentioned this, that in Oregon and in many Western states, the water belongs to the public. So just because you have a well, or just because there's say a natural pond on your property, or there's a stream flowing through your property, does not give you the right to appropriate that water. That's why we have the Oregon Water Resources Department, which is the regulatory body that kind of manages all of that, okay? And the process that you go through with this regulatory body is to make an application. That application eventually gets through the process and you have a permit. That's the opportunity to develop the water use. And then if you need more time, you can seek an extension, which we won't talk too much more about. And the end of the process is you demonstrate to the state, yes, I requested to irrigate 20 acres from this well, and I've done it, and they will confirm that with a water rights certificate. So that's just a little bit of the life history, if you will, of a water right. You probably hear a lot of other terms when you're talking about water rights with people. One that you hear a lot is about the priority date, first in time, first in right. So the priority date is the date in which your application's been submitted and deemed complete by the Oregon Water Resource Department. And I want to be really clear that water rights, they're not necessarily a license, especially for irrigation, to just go do whatever you want. They're very specific in terms of the place where you can use the water, the season that you can use it, like in the Willamette Valley, generally the irrigation season is March 1 to October 31. And I have the term forfeiture on here. This is the use it or lose it. There are some rules out there about if you leave your water right dormant for a long period of time, you could subject yourself to forfeiting your water right. Some of these other terms here I just wanted to throw out there that when you get these permits, they have a lot of conditions. So just because you get to the end of the process doesn't mean you're home free. They could have groundwater level decline conditions. They have rate of use limitations. So those are all things to pay attention to. And I wanted to mention at the very bottom of this list, exempt uses. Kevin did say, if you have a domestic well, you can't necessarily use that for irrigation. But Oregon law does provide some exemptions from the requirement to get a permit. And one of those would be, like Kevin mentioned, if you want to use your well for your domestic use at home. That would be one exemption. Another exemption is you can use up to 5,000 gallons a day without a permit for commercial use. And a lot of wineries that we work with actually do operate under that exemption. So that's important to understand. There are some exemptions from the requirement to get a permit. So here's some general considerations for surface water, groundwater, and storing water in a reservoir. That it's probably pretty obvious that it's difficult to just get a water right to stick a pump in a river anymore. The Water Resource Department has, for the most part, determined that surface water is not available for new appropriation, mostly because it's already spoken for by other water rights that exist. So let's kind of leave that there. I'm going to focus more on groundwater because I think Kevin set me up really well to talk about this, that if you're thinking, okay, I have a vineyard, I'd like to, instead of dry farm, get a groundwater right for irrigation, it's important to just start doing some research. Well, where am I located? Am I located in one of these restricted areas? And I'll show you a map of those. And it's the funniest thing, those restricted areas seem to overlie really well with the popular areas for growing grapes, by the way. And then I also want to mention, if you're interested in groundwater for your irrigation, this thing that I call conjunctive management. This is something that the state of Oregon really prides itself on, and it goes like this. Many years ago, we figured out that the surface water sources of the state were under stress, they were appropriated to their fullest extent, and we understood that. But then we began to understand if you have a well that is right by a surface water source, or maybe even not that close, but hydraulically connected, the pumping of that groundwater has an effect on the stream almost as if you had a pump in the stream. And so the state has done a lot of work to conjunctively manage both how do we protect the water rights and the water resources of a surface water body with groundwater. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. And then, of course, if you want to store water, you have to think about, is water available to do that? And, of course, if you're on a stream channel, what kind of conversations are you going to have with the Department of Fish and Wildlife about fish passage? I want to make this point, which is if you're going to seek a groundwater permit, you need to be patient. It's going to feel like people are presenting hoops to you to jump through because there are a lot of issues that you need to resolve, and it's going to take time. Despite the state getting a lot more resources for their agencies, they still have a very big workload. They're still short-staffed, and it could take upward of 2 years, literally 2 years from the time you start this process to the time you end. So you want to plan accordingly, okay? This is just a quick picture of those limited areas that Kevin already mentioned, and you can see the ones in the Willamette Valley, the Chehalem Mountain, Amity Hills, Walnut Hills, Eola Hills. And again, these are areas that are very limited in terms of your ability to get a water right for the use of groundwater. In some cases, it's not that you can't, but it might be that you can only get it for a period of 5 years with the possibility of renewing it. So practice tip number 1, if you're thinking about getting a water right for the use of groundwater, kind of understand where you lie on this map. The other thing that you want to think about is, what do the well yields look like in your neighborhood? Are your neighbors getting 1.5 gallons a minute out of this very water chintzy, sandstone that you find in a lot of the that is popular in a lot of the wine growing areas? Maybe there's some information that you'd want to try to find through the Water Resource Department. They have this amazing web page where you can go, or just talk with some of your neighbors or a local well driller about what does the well yields look like in this area. A lot of resources out there to understand that. Now I just want to talk a little bit about this conjunctive management issue, because I think this is probably the biggest issue that we run into. Just this week, my colleague, Kim, who I'll introduce at the end here, who's with me, we got a couple calls just this week about someone that said, hey, I'm trying to get a permit from Water Resources, and they said, I have PSI. What does that mean? Well, it means that the Water Resources Department has done some analysis and concluded that the pumping of your well will, in fact, have an impact on surface water resources. And I'm going to kind of walk you through that a little bit just so you understand. And that last bullet is sometimes if you're pumping your well and it's affecting a stream, someone might tell you you might be able to provide some kind of mitigation to get through that. But I'm here to tell you that that is a very, very difficult process, and I rarely see it work successfully, okay? So this is kind of a joke, but not really. This is the flow chart of an administrative rule that the Water Resources Department uses. I don't expect you to get through this. I'll simplify it for you, but this is the process the state goes through to figure out whether this well you're proposing to use has PSI. And I'll walk you through this just real quickly. Here's the basics. If you have a well that's within a quarter mile of a perennial stream, and the state of Oregon determines that you're hydraulically connected to that surface water body, you have PSI. Or if you're within a mile of a perennial stream and you're hydraulically connected and you check one of these boxes, A, B, or C, a high rate, a rate that's greater than a certain amount of the stream flow, or there's this calculation where pumping that well will cause some stream depletion after 30 days. If you check any of these boxes, the state will conclude that you have PSI, okay? So what? What does that mean? What it means is, like I said earlier, if you think you could just, I think we understand that it's very difficult to get a new water right from surface water, especially during the irrigation season. Well, why is that? Number one, that surface water has been largely appropriated to existing water rights. Number two, there's a lot of public interest standards and statements that need to be evaluated if you have PSI. If you have PSI, your groundwater right is now being reviewed by the Department of Fish and Wildlife, by the Department of Environmental Quality, and they all have obligations to protect listed fish, water quality, and all of these things. So if your well is determined to have PSI, you are simply subjected to all, not only the groundwater considerations in the area, but the surface water considerations. And just to put a finer point on that, in Oregon, during the irrigation season, it's very hard to find a surface water body that has water available for appropriation. So what do we do? What does my firm do when we get a call from someone and they say, hey, I'm trying to get a water right, I want to plant some new vines, or I have some vines that I've been dry farming and I want to use my well to irrigate them, and they tell us that they've been using their domestic well to do that, and we say, no, you shouldn't be doing that. You can't kind of push your way through PSI. What you have to do is kind of navigate around it, I guess is the best way to put it. And so what we do is we start working with our clients, many of them owners of vineyards, and say, okay, let's look at where your well's located, and let's start drawing some circles. Let's start drawing a quarter-mile buffer. Let's start drawing a 1-mile buffer and see how you fit in this PSI evaluation. Sometimes the answer to that question is, I think we're going to have to think about drilling a new well in an area outside of a quarter mile, because you're within a quarter mile and you're hydraulically connected, you have PSI, and all the agencies are saying, no way. But if you're outside a quarter mile, within a mile, sometimes we can manage the amount of water you're requesting or the season that you're requesting and help you begin to kind of navigate, is there a way through this? And so kind of using Kevin's example, it's pretty easy if you have a well to fill out an application and send it to the state and try to figure out the answer. What is harder and a lot more strategic to do is go through this kind of exercise and understand what is the answer going to be when I submit my application, thinking about where am I located, where's my well located, how much water am I asking for? And so, second practice tip that I have is it's all about location, really understanding where is your well with respect to surface water bodies, how is your well hydraulically connected. If you're outside a quarter mile, sometimes that rate of appropriation is really important to get you under some of those thresholds for PSI. Because if you have PSI, you're going to go through all those state agencies to think about your impacts on surface water. If you don't have PSI, you're just going to be focused on the groundwater resource. Thinking about season of use, and again, sometimes you'll hear that you might be able to mitigate your way through this, but we have found that to be extremely difficult. So again, that was a pretty deep dive into permitting a groundwater well for irrigation, but I wanted to make sure that we really focused on that today. What are some alternatives that we find ourselves coaching people about? One is, I don't know if Kevin was actually seeking a limited license. There is actually a mechanism that you can request from the state, a limited license to establish a crop. And that gives you 5 years to use this groundwater to establish a crop. That doesn't mean all of these issues of PSI and groundwater availability don't exist, because they still are considered in a limited license. But in some cases, it could help move through the process. So if a permanent water right isn't an option, a limited license could be. Sometimes we have to get really creative with groundwater, and you might have a property that doesn't have a good place to fill a pond, but the state of Oregon is saying, you know what, if you were to pump this well, in the winter months, in the off-season months, we would be okay with that. So sometimes we find ourselves getting a combination of a permit to pump groundwater and then a small reservoir to put that groundwater in the winter months, so that in the summer you could then take the water out of the reservoir. And I know that might sound like a lot of work, but there are a number of clients that we've worked with that have gone down this road because it was their only option. Sometimes we have what we call the storage groundwater combination, where there might be an opportunity to build a storage pond. And I should say that there are still a lot of good opportunities to construct small storage ponds on vineyards. The problem is sometimes people don't have the space, but that is an option. And sometimes we have clients that will use a pond that's filled with runoff and then use their well as a backup supply to augment the supply of the water in the pond in case we're having a dry year. And then there's other things, I won't get into them in great detail, that you can do, where under Oregon law, if you make improvements to your irrigation system and save water, so let's say you have an existing water right, or you buy a property with an existing water right, you can actually make some improvements to that system and save water, and then use that conserved water to irrigate additional land. So instead of getting a new water right, you're simply taking the water right that you have, making more efficient use of it, and adding some additional acres to what you're doing. So those are just some alternatives that we find ourselves utilizing quite a bit in this kind of tough regulatory environment. A couple more things, and then I'll turn it over to Representative Helm. If you're in, a lot of this conversation that we've had so far is if you own a property and you're trying to obtain a water right for irrigation. But what we also find ourselves in a lot of situations is you might be looking at a property to acquire. And what we're shocked with is that I can't tell you how many times after the due diligence is over, water rights on the property almost become an afterthought. So if you are looking at a property that you think would be a good choice for a vineyard or taking over a vineyard, here's some questions that you might want to ask. You know, are there water rights? Are they in good standing? Is it a sufficient amount of water? How's the infrastructure associated with those water supplies? And if there aren't water rights, could you get one? Could you actually go through the process of getting one? So I just wanted to plant that seed if you're looking at additional or new properties. I hope that gives you a sense that, again, we're in a tough regulatory environment, but there are ways. They might not be the first idea that you had to get yourself set up with irrigation water rights, but there are opportunities to obtain a water right for your vines. I wanted to introduce my colleague Kim, if she's back there somewhere. Kim Grigsby is also with me, and so we'll be around afterwards if you want to catch up and ask any questions. So thank you very much.
Good afternoon, folks. Very nice to be here. Ken Helm. I represent House District 36, or 34 rather. It's a location on the north side of Beaverton and parts of southwest Portland. I've been in the legislature since 2015. My background is in law. I'm a land use attorney, now retired, and I spent most of my career trying to make the Portland region a more livable place. I worked at Metro in their land use department, and then as an attorney in private practice. When I arrived at the legislature, that career experience channeled me into our committees that have responsibility for natural resources. So I've spent the bulk of my time working in our Environment and Energy Committee on the House side. I was chair of that for 3 sessions. And then more recently, as chair of the Water Committee on the House side, which we've recently combined with our Agriculture and Land Use Committee to make one committee that tackles all 3 of those areas. So the work that I have done and will be doing in the future very much lands where you work. And I wanted today to cover a little bit of where we think we are going and why in the world of water. I think you've heard some pretty sobering information earlier this morning about climate change. And then Adam and Kevin have told you some pretty cautionary tales too. And just so that we're not expecting sunshine and unicorns, I have to tell you, it's not going to get a lot better soon. From a climate perspective, I heard a presentation by our own Oregon State Climate Center a couple of years ago, a really apt comparison that brought home to me what we are facing here in Oregon. And the comparison was this: looking ahead 20 years, what is the climate going to be like in Portland compared to other places? And the comparison was this: in 20 years, the climate in Portland is going to be like it is today in Sacramento. And any of you who have been in Southern Oregon, Northern California know how hot that is, how long the dry season is. Pretty sobering stuff. So that's sort of the future that we're looking at. The east side of the mountains may be in a little bit more dire straits than we are over here on the west side, but we're not out of the woods either. And that's going to be a reality for the coming years. Moving on from that reality, how do we deal with it at the state level? And Adam described to you the way our regulatory system works now. it will likely be the case that that regulatory system has the same attributes that Adam described as we move forward over the next couple of decades. One of the reasons for that is that Western water law is very inflexible. And to be absolutely clear-eyed about it, it's probably going to remain that way because the right to use water is a type of property right. And that property right, even though it's what's called usufructory, which means you have the right to use the water, but you don't have the right to the water itself, that gets a little academic when you try to take water away from people, which they very much do not like, as you can imagine. And because there is a property right there, if the state tries to take it away completely, we must pay just compensation under both the federal Constitution and the state Constitution. One that doesn't build trust and community benefit to try to do that type of thing. And it's incredibly expensive. It is not a solution that is feasible. So confronted with those sideboards, how do we move forward as a state in trying to get the water that we need in the places that we want it? One of the realities that I think we are facing and we are working on now is that we're going to have to get used to the notion that our senior water right holders, we are going to need to convince them that it is beneficial for them to share their water. And we're going to have to figure out a way for them to do so more than they do today within an administrative structure that allows them to do that, and to some extent, perhaps modifying laws to make it easier for them to do that as well. What we're seeing in places around the state that are coming up against this reality in a way that I would say is reasonable, rational, and not looking away from the problem, is occurring in 4 of our pilot projects that have been going on since 2015 around the state. They're called place-based planning, and what they are is community consensus-based future water planning based on what those communities need. The most poignant example of how this can work is happening far away from here, but the circumstances remain the same, out in Harney County. The residents out there a few years ago started to worry about whether the water that's available to them, which is all groundwater, was going to be enough to satisfy their existing and burgeoning alfalfa industry. When they first entered into exploring what their water budget was and whether it was going to be enough for the future, they immediately ran into a problem that is ubiquitous around the state, which is our data is inadequate. They could not tell with a reasonable level of certainty how much water was in the aquifer, how fast it was recharging season over season, and what was its carrying capacity. What was their water budget? Fortunately, some events came together, some money and some effort from USGS to help them understand their aquifer. And that information became available after, I think, a year and a half at least of study by USGS. Finally gave them a good look at their aquifer. And lo and behold, yes, they had a lot less water than they thought they had. And their aquifer was substantially what we call over-appropriated. More water had been promised to certificate holders than was available, and the recharge, the natural recharge, was not going to make up for it. So what do? They are in a very interesting process in Harney County now, trying to figure out how to make voluntary agreements work into the near future for water sharing. And that's going to be, I think, what is going to be required ultimately, but it's a hard road row to hoe. It's going to require a lot of trust among community members, and to some extent it may include voluntary retirements of water rights too. When you embark on that kind of exercise, you have to depend on your senior water rights holders coming to the table. After all, they don't need to. They have a thing, they have a right. It's worth something. In agricultural parts of this state, that water is worth a lot. And over time, it's probably worth more than the land itself. And so, it's a very delicate process to get them to participate meaningfully in these community-based planning exercises that are very much, I think, the way of the future. And we're not at the end of that exercise by any means, but I think that's where we're headed. We're going to have to realize that we need to share water and spread it around. And as Adam said, we're going to have to navigate around Western water law to do it, probably not modify the law itself. And that's why I say things are probably going to stay about the way they are now in terms of the law and administration. Let me depart from that line of explanation and talk just a couple minutes before we go into questions about what we're doing right now. What has the legislature done? A number of events came together in 2021 that allowed us as a state to put budget resources behind work in the field of water that had been deprived of the department for several decades, I'd say 3 decades. The cold hard reality is natural resource agencies in this state are mostly funded or substantially funded by general purpose funds. That's our taxes. There's a little bit of federal funds that come into them. There are 14 natural resource agencies. They get less than 2% of the state budget. They're always underfunded, and chronically so. That is the reason, in part, and I'm not making an excuse of this, but it's the reason why some of the applications that you've had experiences with and that Kevin explained take so long. There's not enough staff. So in 2021, after several years of work by myself, my good partner, Republican Mark Owens and from Harney County, our sub-chair of Ways and Means, Jeff Reardon, and many others, we were able to carve out a substantial amount of the budget to send to water resources to do some of the things they hadn't been able to do for years, to the order of about $500 million. Much of that money was going to go to individual projects in individual towns for what we think of as infrastructure. So drinking water infrastructure, stormwater infrastructure, sanitary sewer infrastructure. But at the same time, we carved out some money to improve the practices at the agency. That includes a batch of money to increase our capability for finding and gathering the relevant data we need to understand our basins and our aquifers. That is in the process of being spent down right now. We provided money for underserved communities, BIPOC communities who have not, and what we consider to be rural and frontline communities that just never had the capacity before to participate in community water planning. And they certainly have a valuable perspective, and now we've provided them a way to come to the table in a way they've never been able to do before. Similarly, we have reached out to our tribal partners in the state, our 9 recognized Indian tribes. They each have unique relationships to water, and they are geographically diverse. We provided them with some funds to increase their capacity to participate. And most significantly, we set aside some money for a statewide facilitated process that took some level of planning thought outside the department itself and put it with Oregon Consensus, which is a mediation and facilitation adjunct to Portland State, to do a exercise in regional water planning, whether it will work in Oregon and what attributes we want it to have. And that is going on right now. It has turned out to be the most sophisticated and largest conversation this state has had on water, again, in at least 3 decades, with a diverse stakeholder group that will enlarge over the next, over this year as we answer questions about whether we can, in a more detailed way, in a more granular way, look at the needs for all the water users, including fish and wildlife, within basins, which means it's closer to your home, it's closer to what you do, it's closer to where your businesses are, where your vineyards are, and see whether by doing so we can bring people together and understand what work we do need to do in that basin, whether there are particular fish and wildlife needs, whether there's specific groundwater conditions, what are the surface water conditions, are there water quality issues. But all those will be specific to the basin or sub-basin. And we're trying to figure out, can we solve some of our challenges basin by basin instead of the whole state at the same time. So it's going to be a really intriguing, I think, and a very useful process as we go along. And I'll just throw this out there right now before we go to questions. If you want to know more, just find my legislative webpage at the Oregon State Legislature under my office name. Shoot me an inquiry and we'll get you in touch with the facilitators and help you learn more about the process and how you might be able to track it and potentially participate in it. So, with all that being said, I don't want to leave on a down note. The good news is we are working together on consensus-based problem solving in this state ever more. You can see it in the way that we've just solved the dilemma with our Elliott State Forest down in Southern Oregon. And you've seen it in how the timber industry and the conservation community have come together with the Oregon Private Forest Accords. Those are both collaborative problem-solving events, and we just passed them in the short session to memorialize them into state law. We can do the same thing with water, and that's the direction I think we're heading. Thanks. Been nice being with you.
Thanks, Ken. All is not lost. I wanted to share a little different wrinkle on the whole water challenge that I learned when I sold Coosaw Farm at the end of last year. I sold it to a family that owned several wineries in California, and one of their facilities was nearly burned to the ground by the Tubbs fire in 2019. So while they were touring the property, they said to me, "So Kevin, what have you done to mitigate wildfire risk?" And we happened to be standing right next to a fire hydrant that I had installed as part of my rainwater collection system. And I said, "Well, this'll help." And you know what? They really responded to that. That was actually a significant selling point. And I later found out that the reason that was such a significant selling point was before the Tubbs fire, the fire insurance premium for that winery was approximately $8,000 a year. The year after the Tubbs fire, the fire premium for that winery was $80,000 a year. So it isn't just about water for irrigating grapes or water for making wine, but it's for water to fight wildfires too. Any questions? If not, you can go right to lunch. Hey, Peter.
You mentioned earlier in your talk about the runoff. You said it has to be from hard surfaces. We, as you well know, have built reservoirs where we are collecting rainwater running off the fields. Are we going down the wrong path? Is that usable water during the summer?
Adam, you want to attack that one?
Yeah, I can take that.
You might want to repeat the question too, because Peter wasn't on a mic.
Yeah, so the question was that Kevin mentioned his way around water law was to use actually one of the exemptions, which is in statute, which is if you collect rainwater or precipitation off a impervious surface, a roof, a driveway, and you capture that, you can use that without the requirement of having a water right. The example question was if we're catching runoff that's going in a field in a pond, is that considered public water that's subject to a permit? And the short answer is yes, it is. That would be considered public waters, and the appropriation of that, which would be capturing it in a pond, is regulated under Water Resources Department's regulations and would require a permit.
Well, yeah, and we've got permits. We've got permits for storage, building storage, and we've got permits for using the water. And Water Resources has been very cooperative in that kind of situation.
Yeah, so the response was that this said pond that's capturing runoff does have permits from the state of Oregon for the capture and the use of that water. And I probably should have said this more. I was very focused on the use of wells and groundwater and how complicated that is. There is a lot of good opportunities to capture water in the winter from runoff in a pond for irrigation. The complication, of course, is having the right place to do that, having enough ground to do that, and having the watershed to do that. So yes, that is one of the options of choice that we see.
Please.
Yeah, Kevin, nuance on the same topic. If I'm capturing rainwater off my roof, which, by the way, generates 200,000 gallons a year, can I do that without a permit? Can I just go do it?
Yeah, the short answer is that, again, that's exempt from the requirement to have a permit, and that's something you can just do, yes.
Please. It's hard to see up here, by the way.
Thanks, Kevin. Eileen Albridge. This is a question for Adam, but first, thanks to the panel for a good discussion today. I think this is a really important topic, along with wildfire. So I think we'll have more of these in the future. But question for Adam, you talked more about irrigation, but could you share some of your thoughts with this group about the use of the industrial and commercial groundwater exemption and the 5,000 gallon limit per day, and some things that folks from the production side may want to think about as they're increasing their case production and how that might exceed their, to borrow Representative Helm's term, their water budget?
Yeah, thanks, Elaine. It's hard to see, but
Really hard.
Nice to see you. Yeah, so again, we talked about this a little bit, that especially with groundwater, there's a set of uses that are exempt from the requirement to obtain a permit. And I'll just kind of click off a few of them to give you a sense. So you could use up to 15,000 gallons a day for domestic use, which is a lot. And that also includes the irrigation of 1/2 acre of non-commercial lawn and garden. So that's one of the things that are under the exempt uses. Another one that was mentioned is 5,000 gallons a day could be used for commercial or industrial use. And so what we often find, based on the question, was we find wineries that are operating under that exempt use of 5,000 gallons a day. There's no permit required. And as they're planning for the future, they will often call us and start asking questions about, well, what happens when I get to 7,000 gallons a day or 10,000 gallons a day? what do I have to do then? And then I think you're kind of right back into the permitting discussion that we just had about all of those things that I was talking about that are considerations for getting a groundwater permit for irrigation equally apply for a groundwater permit, say for commercial use, for tasting rooms in a winery, which is something we get asked about a lot. So a lot of the same issues in terms of the sustainability of the groundwater, proximity to a creek, all of those would apply.
David?
Kevin, I have a question probably for Representative Helm. It may sound kind of strange to start, but let me draw it back to the water thing. Kevin, in his introductory comments, mentioned the concept of these stacked aquifers that exist in the hills that we probably drill down into and try to find one to satisfy our own needs. The question is, what kind of hydrologic information is involved in permitting for quarries? For example, in the Willamette Hills and in Dundee and other places throughout our hills, there are lots of quarries, and near us there are a number of pits, some of them several hundred feet deep. Every time I hear a dynamite explosion near us, I fear, and if you look at the walls of these quarries, you can see where water is sort of just running way, especially down at the bottom, you can see where water's running out. Every time I hear dynamite going off, I imagine one of these aquifers that are sandwiched in the hills that we draw on. I imagine my aquifer being drained by this quarry. What kind of protection do we have? What kind of knowledge is available ahead of time before somebody actually licenses a quarry to exist and to endanger the water supply?
I'll take an initial cut at this, Representative Helm. And so in my 14 years at Water Resources Department, this was something that I came across several times, and it has been, in certain cases, a very controversial issue, right? Because as you dig down in this quarry, like you just said, you can expose an aquifer, and you could actually relieve the pressure of that aquifer by exposing it and allowing it to discharge into the quarry. And then, of course, the quarry operators are pumping the water out into a ditch to get it out of the way. So kind of the good news is that DOGAMI, the Department of Geology and Mineral Industries, is the regulatory body that evaluates and permits these quarries. And they often work quite closely in conjunction with the Water Resources Department as agencies to evaluate these questions in terms of what are the impacts to wells in the area, to water right holders in the area. It's a little complicated because the ability to pump water out of the pit actually doesn't require a water right. It's not really a beneficial use of water. They're just getting water out of the way. So DOGAMI is really permitting the excavation part, but it is good news that they partner quite closely with the Water Resource Department to address the specific kind of issues that you're asking about.
Great question. Please.
Yeah, I believe there exists a type of permit that's an emergency use permit, and this would only apply in situations where a drought emergency was declared. And I'm just wondering if one or both of you could comment on kind of what the current regulations are around that, and whether there's any plans for changing or, adjusting those types of permits as they become more necessary.
So I'll answer this in two ways. One is, remember I was ticking off uses of water that are exempt from the requirement for a permit, and I was mostly talking about groundwater, but also there are exempt uses of surface water that are not required, that do not require a permit. One of those is for emergency firefighting. So if there's a fire, you know, we've seen helicopters dipping in ponds or people using water. That is not a requirement to get a permit to do that. The second provision that I'm aware of is, I earlier mentioned a limited license where you can get a limited opportunity to irrigate for up to 5 years to establish a crop. There's also a type of limited license that if there's an emergency, you simply provide notice that you need this limited license, and it's, you know, it has to rise to the level of an emergency that, you know, is related to public health, safety, and welfare. And the director of the water resources, with very little fanfare, can approve that emergency use limited license. I'm not aware, I don't know that I've ever seen one of those issued, but I'm imagining it would be, you know, a city loses its water supply from a stream and has to go start pumping a well or something like that, where it would truly be an emergency of public health, safety, and welfare. Those are the instances that I'm aware of.
Let's see. Thank you. I'll just point out, you may have seen it in the news, Governor Kate Brown issued the first drought declaration a couple of days ago, I think, for Klamath County. The news reported that this is one of the earliest that a drought declaration has ever been made, earliest in the year. And so I think there's more to come. The drought in Klamath, in the Klamath region last year, in combination with the bootleg fire and others, really devastated folks down there. And in the long run, not only is that unfortunate for them, but we do spend a significant amount of state resources in those types of emergencies. And I would expect more drought declarations to be coming in the months ahead, unfortunately.
I would just, maybe just to add to that, once the governor declares a drought in a particular jurisdiction by county, the Water Resources Department does have some drought emergency rules that don't necessarily just allow you to go use water willy-nilly, but there are a lot more opportunities to get access to water much faster once a drought's been declared. So I should make sure folks know about that.
Okay, well, technically our time's up, but Mike, you want to toss in one more?
Sure. You mentioned that there's a little more flexibility in collecting water in a pond and using it in the summer. Do you see any changes in the regulations around building ponds, or are we okay with that for the next few years?
Well, at least from where I see that work going on, if you are in a channel, obviously, where there's aquatic species, fish or other aquatic species, it is much more difficult, and we have state agencies, especially the Department of Fish and Wildlife, that take a really, really hard look at that and may require you to pass water earlier in the year or not storing it until later in the year. If you're off channel, it's a lot smoother sailing, but so far, so good in terms of that opportunity. It's not necessarily that you can store, start storing water, November and go all the way through June. But as you all know, we could have one event in January or February that can fill a small pond in a day. So seize the moment.
I just want to say I built a pond, a fairly large pond, and I found the process, while it was hoops to jump through, it went well. And I think, and I believe the OWRD believes, that increasing the number of ponds, particularly those that are unlined, is a really positive methodology to improve groundwater resources moving forward, because those ponds, after they've captured that water, then slowly release it back into the groundwater supply, into the landscape. And as we heard in the talk earlier this morning, something that we're going to face as we go forward is we aren't going to have snowpack. Right now, that's our number one source of stored water for when we need it in the summertime. If that's gone, we really need to encourage more ponds in the landscape to keep water from flowing out to the ocean during the winter months. Okay, with that, I just want to acknowledge Chad Vargas for New Gen Vineyard Management for putting this together. He's actually in Washington, D.C. lobbying for research funds for the Small Fruit Center, so he's doing good work, but he couldn't be here today. Thanks very much.
Thanks to our panel. Always really great information. Thank you for being with us. There is lunch for you all. Just behind you, grab a sack lunch, find a seat. At 12:45, we're going to start our annual meeting for OWA, and we're all going to be here, and we'd love for you guys to sit in and hear what we've been doing at OWA. So see you back right here in 10 minutes. Thank you. Thanks again.
Thank you.